this is the second of 4 lessons that Professor Neil Shubin will give as a guest professor here at Collège de France. He's professor of anatomy in the University of Chicago. He's a very well-known colleague who works at the interface between a variety of fields, and we actually started to see this last week, but it's going to be even more apparent today, as I heard. The last thing I'd like to say is that, again, I'd like to express my gratitude. I'm very grateful to him to have maintained this visit to the Collège de France, despite this very complex task that is waiting for him next year as the new president of the National Academy of Science in Washington, D.C. Neil, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Merci. Merci. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you today to give these 4 lectures on our relationship with les poissons, the fish inside of us. And I have to say, this has been a distinct pleasure because I get to write new lectures that make me think about things in a new way and hopefully help you as well. What you're seeing today is that we're going to be talking about the origin of walking. Yes, I know I'm showing a pig running and a bird running, but ultimately what we are going to do today is to talk about the fish, les poissons. That's what this is about. And what we're doing is building on the second lecture and moving to the future ones where we are ultimately interested in how do new things arise in evolution. And today we're going to be talking about the origin of a new function. But this is really building on what we did in the first lecture. So just to review what we did in the first lecture, we began with a question. The question we began with is, how did fish evolve into tetrapods? How did fish with fins living in water evolve into creatures that have the structures capable of living on land? Okay? And I spent some time in the last lecture talking about how to approach this as a paleontologist, how to approach this as a fossil finder, how we find new fossils. And what I showed is that we can lead expeditions around the world to discover creatures that bridge the gap between fish and land-living animal. And this is just one of them, Tiktaalik rosea, which my colleagues and I discovered in the Canadian Arctic. There are others as well. And what they do together is they do several things. One is they show us how great transitions in the history of life happen. But importantly, which was the focus of the first lecture, we can, using the fossil record, using comparative anatomy, comparing different creatures, trace the structures that arose in fish at that transition to our own bodies. We can trace the bones of the appendages to ourselves. We can trace the neck to ourselves. So our history is embedded in the fish, and we can see this history when we discover fossils. The other thing we did in this talk, which were in the first lecture, was really to show how this is captured in our genome and how this is captured in our development from egg to adult. And when we understand how we develop from egg to adult, we can begin to bridge the gap between forms that look very different. A fish with a fin, which you could see here, looks very different from a creature with an arm and a leg like ours. Yet when we know how to look at development, we begin to see common features that are so important, not only to our evolution, but also to our own bodies today. And I talked about the example, say in fins and limbs, you're seeing a limb on the left and a fin of a skate on the right. And I'm showing one gene, a gene known as sonic hedgehog. I showed how that is expressed or active in a similar way among people, chickens, and fish of different kinds. We show what happens that you can have similar changes that happen in development in between tetrapods and fish when you mess with those genes, and how those changes are embedded in the chromosome. They're embedded in the DNA that controls the activity. So this is a long way of saying that we could see the fish inside of us when we look at the genome, when we look at development, and we look at fossils that bridge this. Okay, that reviews the first lecture, and that sets us up for what we're going to ask today. What we're going to ask today is, how did walking evolve? The reason why I chose this is because this is a question that bridges multiple fields, that tells us in some key way how important new features evolve and arise. And you can look at the origin of walking, and you could look at the extremes. You could look at the extremes of a fish that swims, of a creature that walks on land with, walking on 4 legs, using a gait, walking with the 4 legs, and so forth. And the main message I'm going to begin with this lecture, and the main lesson I'm going to end with this lecture, is that we should avoid thinking about, and this is obvious at some level, but it's not obvious really when you really get into the details. That is, when you look at this transition from fish to tetrapod, we have to remove this kind of way of thinking, that it's a linear sequence, that is, that there's a big difference between water and land. The reality, which I hope to impress upon you within the next hour or so, or less, is really that there are no simple dichotomies, that there are no simple distinctions between water and land, that the creatures that are evolving in water in ancient ecosystems are actually living in a terrestrial-ish environment, that there's intermediates between water and land, that there is no intermediates, that there are intermediates, there are simple dichotomies between fish and tetrapod, land-living animal. We talked a little bit about that last time, we're going to bridge that more here. And there are no simple dichotomies between swimming and walking. That is, the more we look, the more we break down these distinctions. Okay? Now, to do this, we're going to look at the environment that this happened, this event, the origin of walking happened. We're going to look at the anatomical structures that were evolving in these environments. And we're going to look at the physiology and the function and how these work together. Now, here what I want to show to you is that when we think about the origin of walking, you could think about the origin of new creatures, new species, and new anatomical structures in those species. But importantly, that's only part of the question. The big part of the question is the origin of new environments. The world is evolving as these creatures are. And I'd like to ask the question, what is a key factor in the origin of walking, in the origin of our own walking, and the bird and the pig that you saw earlier? One of the key things that's related to our own walking is the evolution and origin of plants. That it's impossible to think about our history, our deep history, without thinking of the important debt we owe to what's happening in the world and how plants themselves are evolving. And why do I say this? Is because for the time period that we're looking at, from about 420 million years ago to 360 million years ago, from a time period, the period known as the Silurian, all the way to the late Devonian, over this period of 80 million years or so or more, you have the origin of an entirely new world. Terrestrial ecosystems, land ecosystems themselves are coming about. When you look at 420 million years ago in the Silurian, you don't see trees. You don't see extensive land plants. In fact, much of the world is very different geographically. And as we proceed from Silurian to Devonian to the late Devonian, we see the origin of trees, of bushes, of whole new terrestrial ecosystems themselves. So it's hard to consider the origin of walking, anatomically, developmentally, genetically, all that stuff, in absence of thinking about what's happening to the world itself at this time period. Now, why is that important? Well, why that's important is plants made an entirely new world. So thank you, plants. One of the big things you can think about is the origin of trees with root systems themselves. So what I'm showing you in this diagram here is going from early Devonian to late Devonian, period about 40, it's extending about 60 million years or so. Going from a world which didn't have anything reaching high like trees to the late Devonian where you have things reaching high like trees. So you can look at the surface. But the real important stuff is what's happening below the surface. You have, with the origin of terrestrial plants, the origin of new root systems that go ever deeper, that grip the ground and erode the ground. And what this does is this change, where you not only have new ecosystems on land, it's changing with root systems, it's changing what the world looks like. Root systems with trees are enabling the first soils to develop. And what that enables is the first small streams with stream banks. So it's changed the topography. It's changed the morphology of the terrestrial world itself. And so what you have is a new landscape that's possible with the origin of new plant systems, with roots and so forth, that are capable of having small, stable, freshwater streams. The environments themselves, these environments themselves, are as new as the creatures that were to evolve inside them. And it's hard to think about those creatures in absence of this new world that's emerging here. And so the other thing that plants did is they invaded land first, well before our distant ancestors did. And what followed them were the invertebrates. So there were new sources of food on land as well. Invertebrates followed the plants on land. So throughout the time period that we're interested in today, we're seeing change throughout the Devonian period, over 60 million years. Plants are evolving tree systems, deep root systems. That's making soils. That's changing the geography of the world. So a new geography with stable small streams, among many other things, is coming about. And then the invertebrates, now that you had plants on land, the invertebrates followed, and you have new food on land. You know, there's now reason to be on land that there wasn't millions of years before. Now also, though, in water things are changing. There's a new challenge for fish living in water. Because we see for the first time involving in water is large predators. And this is happening in the ocean, as you see here. Also in these new freshwater streams. This is a creature that lives in these freshwater streams. It's about 4 meters long at its largest. So these are big monsters with huge teeth that are larger than our thumbs. You have ecosystems that are developing in these new streams with large predators. So life is really filling out in important new ways on land, but also in water. And these predators are not just vertebrate fish. This is an example from the Devonian. You have lobster-like creatures that are larger than a human. Take-home message from these slides: you don't want to swim in these streams. Okay, so when we look at these streams, you know, and this is a picture of a reconstruction. I showed this last time. This is a site, a Devonian site. We worked in Pennsylvania in the United States. And it's one of these shallow streams. They're teeming with life. They're teeming with those large predators. You could see on land, you have trees with shrubs and the root systems. What you have is now a whole new world where walking becomes not only possible, but necessary for many creatures. Okay, that's the setting that we're talking in here. And what that means is really, and I want you to, this is important to think about this, is that in this context with these new environments, there's no simple dichotomy between living in water and living on land. Sure, at the extremes, if you're living in the desert and living in the ocean, yes, there's a dichotomy. But the more you look at the ecosystem itself, there are all kinds of intermediate environments for creatures to evolve in and live in. So think about it. You can have creatures walking and living in the water bottom, supported by water, which is a perfect antecedent to walking. You can have creatures living in now the shallows, which are new environments. Yeah, you can have creatures living on land, but they can living on wetland in the mud flats or on the dry land. What I'm saying is there's a great texture to these environments. It's not just one thing, water and land. Water itself has many conditions that where walking itself would be advantageous. Okay, and these are new. These are environments that form, and you can thank plants for a lot of this stuff. Okay, that's kind of the setting. Furthermore, remember I told you that in this setting here, when we look at the fossils, and again, this is extending from last week's lecture, is again, there's no simple dichotomy between fish and tetrapod, limbed animal. Sure, there are some, digits are one thing, but for the most part, when you look at a neck, when you look at the shape of the head, when you look at the support of the body, when you look at the limbs, in fact, many of the bones and limbs originally arose in these lobe-finned fish. And when you look at lungs, all these creatures had lungs as well. So, you know, really these morphological conditions begin to break down. Furthermore, when we put some of these creatures on an evolutionary or phylogenetic tree, and you could see the lobe-finned fish that are fossil lobe-finned fish that are at the base of the tree, and you have tetrapods. These are limbed animals here from the late Devonian. Tiktaalik and a number of other creatures, you know, really kind of bridge these gaps in big ways. When you look at the pelvis, when you look at the fin, when you look at the shape of the head, again, no strict dichotomy. Okay, so that's kind of the prelude that we're looking at. And in fact, the more we look at this, the more we see that swimming and walking break down in some ways. And I'm going to show a new discovery, which we made last summer. We haven't published it yet, but we're very excited about it. And what it shows, and I think this is important for what we're going to touch on in the later part of the lecture, is that when we look at these creatures that are at the cusp of the transition between fish and land-living animals, when we look at those critters, like this one here, which is Tiktaalik rosea, the hip and the shoulder are really surprising us. They're telling us surprising things about the origin of walking, that when we break it down physiologically, looking at living creatures, it makes total sense. But when you look at it in abstract of that, it may not. Let me focus on the new discovery, and we'll build from there, okay? So I want you to look at this creature. This is Tiktaalik rosea, the creature we discovered in the Arctic. And it's particularly, the reason why I talk about it is, it's very well preserved. And you could see here's the shoulder on the left, and on the right is the pelvis. That's the hip there. And the pelvis, we're going to start there because you can see this little gap. That little gap is that when we published this diagram in about 2 years ago, we had a gap. We didn't have the femur. We didn't have the upper leg bone. And it was a real problem. I hated that. That bothered me. So that means we had to go back to the Arctic to find a single bone. And that tells us enormous amounts. So let me just show you, here's the hip. I'm just going to focus on the hip. So that's that pelvis, right, I showed you before, and it's swinging around. These are the ribs, these are the vertebrae in blue. And what should amaze you is this blade of the hip is big. There's a big area for muscle attachment. Look at this thing here. See then that socket that's swinging around? Here comes swinging around right there. It's going to swing around again. There's the socket. Come on, you can do it. Right there. Big socket for the femur to fit in, right? So this hip's doing something big, right? What's more is that you have an attachment between the rib and the back and the pelvis as well, meaning this thing not only is big and has a big socket for the hip, but it's being supported by the back. So this creature is using its hind fin for something that requires a lot of forces, okay? But we didn't have the femur. Now that's unfortunate because I'm going to show you, here's the hip again. I'm showing you a different view. This is Tiktaalik in an evolutionary tree. This is the hip I showed you. And you're seeing it from lateral view, from the outside, okay? And there's that big socket. See that socket there? That's the one that was swinging around and I made such a big deal out of. And you could see the socket in an early tetrapod, a creature known as acanthostega. That's the socket there. And when you look at these two sockets, hip sockets, a little weird, right? I mean, here you see the socket, but there's something else going on there, like a little notch in the front. When you look at acanthostega, there are these notches in the front and back as well. What's going on there? Something that bothered me a lot. Because we didn't have, not having the femur really pissed me off. Anyway, so we had to go back to the Arctic, and it took us 5 years to get back to the Arctic after we had this quest. Why? Because COVID, and then a helicopter crash, and then all kinds of stuff. There was a lot of things that kept us there. But we finally got back there last summer, and we worked near the Tiktaalik site on Ellesmere Island. Here's Ellesmere Island up in A. Let's zoom in on Ellesmere Island here in B. And we went here. It's about, I'd say, 150 kilometers from the Tiktaalik site itself. So it's a new site we decided to look. And the reason why we decided to look there is because I had flown over that site for years, getting to the Tiktaalik site, you know, when we were working it. And I always looked down out of the plane, my colleague Ted and I looked down out of the plane and said, we got to go to this site, it looks great. So we went there, and this is what the area looked like. And it was perfect in terms of stratigraphy, the geological age as well. Well, we got there, and we didn't find much. But then, and probably one of the most remarkable finds of my career, I didn't make it, Ted did, but it was one of the most remarkable we both experienced, is on the surface of the rock, of the rock, eroded a Tiktaalik specimen that was completely cleaned by the wind. So imagine walking here looking for a fossil, right, which you had spent years finding, and we had years before we cracked rocks to do. Here, looking down, we had a specimen that had eroded out of the rock, and in sitting on the surface of the polar world, it was eroded by the wind so that every piece of it was now exposed. And I had a graduate student, Emily Hillen, who was working on the hip of Tiktaalik, and all of a sudden this changed her thesis entirely. Here's Emily, see the big smile right there. She's holding two femora that sat on the surface, and you could see other bones here that we collected, and literally on this surface right in here, actually further off the slide. But there are a number of things. You can see a snout there, you can see the back of a head. There's all kinds of stuff there. It was truly remarkable, because we didn't have to prepare. We didn't have to take this back to the lab and sit there with needles and pins and remove the grains. Wind and the polar world did this for us. And here's what the femur, the upper leg bone, looks like. This is it. We didn't even prepare this. I took this picture in the field, okay? In the tent, a couple days after we discovered it. And here's the ventral or belly surface of it. And this is where the knee would be. So this is the femur. So the tibia and fibula would be fitting in here, which would be the knee. This is where the hip would be on the top. Now, the first thing that can strike you is that this is part of the hip joint right here. But you're looking at the belly surface of this. It's lying flat. You're seeing most of it looking at you. That means if you were to fit this in to the hip, this is a bone that faces down, not away. Capisce? Okay, so that's one thing. Now, if you're looking at that head here of the femur, okay, now you're going to get the real surprise, the one that just blew us away, is that this is now you're looking from the hip onto the femur. Here's the head of the femur, right? This is what's going to fit into that big socket I showed you before in the pelvis that was rotating around. But then there's this other thing right here. There's a second joint right there. What is that doing? Now it gets interesting, because what we can do is we could take that and fit it into the pelvis. Well, we found a pelvis with this, by the way, on the surface next to it. And then we were able to put it together. Actually did that in the field. And when you put them together, this big head fits into that large socket, into the pelvis. That little one, remember I showed you the little one, fits into that little notch right there. Now this thing is getting really interesting. Because when we can put it together, here's the pelvis on the top, here's the femur on the bottom. We put them together in the most natural position. This thing faces down, facing down towards the ground. And we can show this quantitatively. Mechanical engineer who works in my lab, Dr. Nalima Sharma, designed a program where you can actually look at the surface of the joints. You can look at the convexity on one side and the concavity in the other. And you can find quantitatively the areas and position of maximal overlap and maximal stability. And it turns out, when you map this around, this is the field that she generated with this program, that in yellow is the area of maximum overlap. The femur is facing downwards. It's kind of intuitively, what we saw intuitively, she can show this quantitatively. But here's what's really important. When it's facing downward, that secondary little joint comes in place, and it locks the femur in place. So the femur can move on the hip like 360 degrees when it's facing to the side. But as soon as it faces down, which is its natural position, it locks into place. And you could see when we look at a phylogenetic tree, an evolutionary tree here, here's Eusthenopteron, which is a lobe-finned fish fossil. Here's Tiktaalik, the creature I just showed you, and here's Acanthostega. You can trace these joints. You go from a ball and socket joint in these kinds of creatures, and it's not just one creature, you have several fossils here. And you have Tiktaalik with the double joint, right? There's the two heads on the femur, there it fits into these sockets, and here's Acanthostega with its odd joint, and it fits into this accessory thing as well. So what's going on? What's going on here is you have a joint that when it's facing to the side, it can function like a paddle. But when it faces downwards, which is its natural position, it can lock into place. Now that's important for a creature if it's living on the water bottom and holding the ground as the water bottom, as the water goes above it to capture food, called station holding. It doesn't have to spend any muscle energy to support its hip. The bone is doing it for it. It's free of charge, right? Also, if the creature is, the fin's facing down and it wants to walk, and like a normal fish, it bends its back, it gets support for propulsion, not by moving the limbs, but by locking them in place and bending its back. So this creates the setting, as this hypothesis creates the setting for a creature to get stability at the hip for free, which can be used in hugging the bottom and also in walking using axial or back bending. And in fact, this forced us to look at the shoulder of Tiktaalik again And when you look at the shoulder of Tiktaalik, here it goes swinging around. Let's look at the shoulder. Here's the shoulder socket. There's the humerus on the right. There's a big head. Uh-oh, what's going on there? There's another notch there. And look at the socket on the shoulder, the glenoid it's called. Here's the socket, and oh, there's another one right there. This thing is functioning like the hip. So again, you have these locking joints that can function in one context like a fin, right, moving around. But when they face ventrally, lock in place, and they can get support sort of free of charge. So what does this mean? This is passive stability, we call it, at the shoulder and the hip. The fin is locked in place while on the water bottom. We call that station holding. It holds the bottom and can sit on the bottom as the current goes by and get food. But it can also lock in place during axial bending of the back to walk. And it looks like this is an incipient stage in evolution in walking. Now, the key thing here is you don't need to use the muscles. You're getting this for free in this stage. Now, this is going to mean a lot later in the lecture. I'm going to talk about robots later in the lecture, and this will mean a lot after we talk about robots. All right. So that's important. Now, there's another piece of this record, too, because we're trying to put together many different lines of evidence here. There are, earlier in the fossil record than we've discovered Tiktaalik, there are well-known and really remarkable footprints, trackways in the Devonian. And these are trackways that extend. You can see them here. You can see the imprints there that extend for a while. And there are different kinds of them. They're known from Poland. They're known from Australia. They're known from Ireland. And they're really remarkable. And what's especially remarkable about them is how early and old they are. Here are the tracks. So this is the stratigraphic record here. And these lines are what age we find the fossils in an evolutionary tree. So Tiktaalik and its relatives are here. Limbed animals are here on the right. But if you look early, really early, about 15 million years earlier than Tiktaalik, you have these trackways that are much more ancient than Tiktaalik and tetrapods. So we've thought for a long time that perhaps that we're missing a lot of the record here. But are we? Or are we seeing something else that's really important? Let me ask that question. Let's look at those trackways. Here's the trackways from Ireland. Gorgeous site, by the way. Curry, Ring of Curry, gorgeous part of Ireland. And here you can see the trackways. These are Devonian. These are earlier than Tiktaalik. And you can see this site here is remarkable because it has many. It's described by Stossel in 2016. But look at this one here. Here you have, look at that, big old body drag. Creature's pulling its body along in the mud, captured in rocks. They're really old. It's really remarkable to see. And here you see the footprints. We decided, well, I'm working with colleagues who work on living fish, which we'll talk about later. What kind of trackways do fish make when they walk? Maybe these aren't tetrapods. Maybe they aren't lived animals. The thing that you have to keep in mind here is when you look at all these trackways, which are composed of hundreds of prints, whether they're in Poland or Ireland or Australia, not a single one of them shows any digits. Not even a little furrow for digits. Maybe that's signal rather than noise. Let's look to see what tetrapods do. Not tetrapods. Let's look at what fish do. They poissons. This is about the fish. So here's the mud skipper. Okay? Here's a mud skipper. Look how cute they are. Pops out of the mud, and as the name implies, they skip through the mud with their fins, and they prop themselves. They row, essentially, with the pectoral or front fins, like this. They row, okay? And the hind fins come in and do their part as well. I was working with colleagues who were from Canada who were visiting Indonesia, where these creatures lived, and they found their trackways in the mud. And they did many analyses of these trackways. And here's like an example. There's the mud skipper right there, and it just literally walked through the mud here. Okay, so you're capturing a fish walking through the mud. What do you see? You see a big body drag, so it drags its body. And you can see where the fins would do that motion. No digits, fins rowing through the motion. And you look at the zoom, here's the body drag in the middle in D, and there's where the pectoral fin goes, and there's the hind fin. So you have big and little pectoral fin, hind fin as they run through the mud. Well, it's hard to look at this Devonian track, which has no digits, and not compare it to what we're seeing here. Why call these tetrapods if they don't have digits? Moreover, when we know living fish can make a version of these trackways too. Now, I'm not saying that mud skippers existed in the Devonian. There's no evidence of that. But what I'm saying is fish reasonably, knowing how they move about, could have made trackways like the ones we see. It gets even more interesting when we look at what living fish can do, because they continually surprise us. That is, here's a lungfish. And if you keep them in the lab for a long enough time and you watch them, they start to do surprising things. See, it's walking on two legs. It's being bipedal. Dan Lieberman, a bipedal fish now, it's walking in the water. And the reason why it can do this is it has a lung. It takes a breath and supports the front of its body, and that whole body is supported by air, by the initially buoyant, and it can walk. And when you look at the trackways these things can make, they make a hit of alternating gaits with a bipedal walk. Now, what am I saying here? If we look at the evolutionary tree, there's a signal here. There's two ways to look at this. You could say, well, these tracks represent tetrapods and that we have a big gap. Or we can look at the evidence of living fish and say, well, no, if they lack these things like digits, maybe these are made by fish walking, because we know fish are evolving then. When you look at all these trackways that are early here, of which there are many trackways and hundreds of prints, there's not a single evidence of digits in those. But what's interesting here is there is a trackway known from the late Devonian, from Australia. You look at this one, it's only one trackway. So it's not the zillions, but it has little prints for digits. So the way I would interpret this, based on the evidence of the fossil record, based on what we know about fish, is that you have digited trackways in the late Devonian, non-digited trackways, all kinds of different kinds earlier in the Devonian, and this means to me walking arose prior to digits. That is, I think, the message that we see. And I think, in some sense, that should surprise nobody. Why? Because when we look at extant fish, I showed you the pig and the bird in the front, but I probably should have showed you these things, because you have mud skippers that walk, you have lungfish that walk, you have sharks that walk with quadrupedal gaits, alternating gaits of the limbs. You have frogfish and sargassum fish that walk with little hand-like structures in their fins. We have skates, which glide, but they actually can walk bipedally with their hind fins. I mean, walking isn't an unusual behavior in fish. Walking is a behavior we see over and over and over again in fish. Many times. And in fact, we see many different kinds of walking as they appear in fish. So I think when you sort of layer in what we see from different lines of evidence, the diversity of fish, the trackway record, evolutionary record, the environmental record, it really does appear walking phylogenetically, evolutionarily, appeared earlier than digits, that walking is a relatively common strategy. And maybe we have to think about a different question, not like how we evolved to walk, but it's more our walking probably originally arose in fish living in these new aquatic systems. So they're living in water. They're living in environments that are novel because of the plants that made this new world. Then we want to ask the question, why would fish walk? What do they get out of the deal? What's in it for them? Okay, why would this ever evolve? So that shifts the question. Rather than asking how walking arose in tetrapods, or amphibian-like ancestors, how did walking evolve in fish? And how did diverse kinds of walking come about? And what does it do for the animal? Because it's in this setting that many of the anatomical things we talk about and many of the developmental and genetic things I'm going to talk about in lecture 4 have come about. That's the big setting here. I'm setting the stage. So you can think about it. You can ask, well, why do fish walk? You can look at sort of categories of hypotheses. Some are easier to test than others. But I can think of 3, I can think of many, but there are 3 sort of broad ones I could think about. You could probably add to this list a little bit. One is energetics. Maybe walking is in some way in certain environments with certain body forms, maybe it's more energetically efficient than other modes of locomotion. Maybe they get an energetic benefit from using walking. It's possible. Control. And this relates to neurobiology to some extent, actually tying into sensation as well. Maybe they're able to control their activities more and control directionality or evade predators or get prey. Maybe there's a control reason for it. And other thing to think about is fins are actually sensory structures as well. They're sensing the water bottom. An elegant paper appeared about 2 years ago showing from colleagues at Harvard, University of Chicago, and Stanford that fins are actually are very sensory. And they function like us, like our limbs in a dark room, right? In a dark room, what do? You feel about with your hands. Well, that's what fish are doing in the bottom of the water. So the energetics control and sensation. So what we decided to do is to really think, this started about 4 years ago, really think a little bit about, not all three of these, because we're not set up to do that, but really think about the energetic piece, because that seemed like the easiest one to test. Now, these aren't mutually exclusive, okay? All three can and probably are acting. In fact, these two relate. Control and sensation certainly relate. Control and energetics certainly relate. So you cannot consider these in isolation, but we have to sort of begin somewhere, so that's the idea. So we developed a collaboration with colleagues at the Scripps Oceanographic, myself at Chicago, and the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole. Fumiya Ida, who's a roboticist at the University of Cambridge. Valentina DeSanto, who's a fish physiologist, biomechanist at Scripps Oceanographic, and a variety of postdocs from our different labs. You've already seen Nalima. She's the one that did that Tiktaalik joint thing. To really think about how we can begin to look at fish walking in novel ways. And we were funded generously by Human Frontiers program, which does these really creative, collaborative grants. It was really a fabulous, and continues to be a fabulous experience for us. Now, Valentina trained with George Lauder at Harvard, and some of the work she did at Harvard actually translates to the way we're thinking about this. And I think the way we've been thinking about it is something that came out of the Lauder lab, but then Valentina really ran with this in a very, very big way. And it's her thing she ran with. And so for the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about things that Valentina DeSanto did. So she talks about a J-shaped speed-energetic relationship hypothesis. And this is well supported by data. And the idea is this. Now you have a fish here, so you have a graph. You have energy consumption measured in sort of oxygen consumption. It's actually scaled for mass. In swimming, so think about this as energy consumption during swimming. Think about this speed. So when you look at a fish, you can think of two broad classes of fish. You could think about fish that are neutrally buoyant, that have a swim bladder, and ones that like to sink, that don't. And the energetics are going to be different for them in these cases. But the central idea holds. That is, at very low speeds, there'll be high costs of maintaining posture. That is, just hovering and staying in the same position in a current, or even not in a current, that it's expensive, relatively expensive. And that at high speeds, as the thing swims fast, it also is consuming lots of energy. Why? Because if you pay attention to birds and things that are aerodynamic, there's a high body drag. You're pushing against the substrate in a big way. And that, whether it's a bird or a fish, that is, there's an optimal speed here, which is in this J or U-shaped curve, where energy expenditure is minimized. Because it's expensive to go slowly or hover. It's expensive to go fast because of body drag. So you're always in this cascade between high postural cost and high body drag, and that defines this gap here. To do this, we developed what's called the fish gymnasium. Yes, there's a fish gymnasium. And yes, there's a fish treadmill. This is the fish treadmill. The fish treadmill is about 3 times the size of this podium here. And it basically is a flow tank where you have a motor that drives water going in a circle, and there's a little clear treadmill here. What that means is you can have a camera that looks at the fish as it's walking from below and the side and the top, so you get a 3-dimensional view of the thing walking on a treadmill. And you can train the fish to walk on the treadmill. And in the water, you can sample with a respirometer oxygen consumption in the water. So you can actually look at energetics and speed. And there's a problem. I'm making it sound easy, but it's actually quite difficult. But you can do these things, but you have to pay the price. It's expensive. It's time consuming. So the sorts of things is looking at metabolic rates of different speed. Here's a trout. Let me turn off the sound. Here's a trout. And again, this is from one of Valentina's early papers with George Lauder. And you can see it's sort of a J-shaped curve. That is, cost at high speeds, cost at low speeds, although not as high speeds, but there is a J shape here. Likewise, you look at something that's not neutrally buoyant, like a skate or a shark or something like that. You can also look at catfishes and other things. You still have this U or J-shaped curve where it's costly slow, costly fast, and there's this optimum in the middle. And you can ask, why is that? Well, here's a fish hovering. It's not going anywhere. Okay, it's staying in the same place. It's not walking, it's not going forward, it's just sitting there in a current. Well, to maintain that actually takes a lot of hidden stuff happening. It's moving its fins. You can see its caudal fin being twitched, its dorsal, anal, and so forth. They're feathering their fins just to stay in place. So it's expensive for a fish sometimes just to stay in place. And when you layer all this together, so just maintaining posture at slow speeds is expensive. And what they showed is essentially, here's energetics again, and these are different species of fish, of different kinds, different body shapes, living in different environments, okay? So controlling for all that. But you see in each case the difference between pink and blue. One is resting, where they'll just sit on the bottom and not hover, or hovering, that it costs energy just to hover, just to stay in place for a fish. It's not cheap. And in fact, it even gets even more expensive if they're going very slowly. So that's kind of the idea here. That is that hovering and swimming at slow speeds has metabolic costs. Now, what we don't know, and we still have yet to demonstrate, is it more efficient to walk at slow speed than swim at slow speed? So we know swimming at slow speed has pretty high metabolic costs, but we're still trying to crack the nut experimentally of how is it actually cheaper to walk than swim at these slow speeds. So stay tuned, maybe in about a year or two. And the challenge there is a lot of these fish are kind of small, and that fish treadmill is pretty big, and the respirometers just can't keep up with that, the amount of oxygen that's consumed. But it's not just energetics, it's actually more. Some of these fish are deeply unstable at slow speeds. So like Polypterus, which is a walking fish, is a creature, this is PIV, so they're swimming in these particles, and you hit it with a laser, and you can get a sense of how the water is moving around their fins and their body. But yes, hovering is much more expensive than resting. But also the creature just can't orient itself. It's very expensive for it just to orient these fish. And in fact, if you make Polypterus try to swim slowly, it won't do that well. It will vastly prefer to go to the bottom and walk. Now here's where it's interesting. This is where I'm going to end. When you look at Polypterus with its, and this is that fish I showed you, going to slow speeds, it goes to slow speeds. It doesn't like to do that. It'll go to the bottom and it'll start to walk, and it'll do that even from the water bottom all the way on mud and land. What it does is it bends its back and pulls around its fin. Now that wasn't very impressive, but one part of the fish gym that we have at Woods Hole and now at Scripps is we can train these fish to walk. And after 6 months of making the fish walk to get their food, what you see is here, this is 6 months of training, the Polypterus has a very distinctive gait. Look at this. Bends its body and pulls around its fin. Bends its body, pulls around its fin. Bends its body, pulls around the fin. Doing this. They do this in an incipient way, untrained, but boy, do they get good at it after 6 months of training. And in fact, that's a natural motion for a living Polypterus. So this gait, where they're bending the body and pulling or crutching around the fin, bend and pull, is a form of walking we see in these fish that are deeply unstable at slow speeds. And we can actually break this down. That is, we call this an undulating tripod gait. And you can break it down. You can say, okay, simply, let's say the body has 1, 2, 3 segments and 2 fins. And you can look at how it bends and when the fins touch the ground. And you can have a characteristic bending, pulling gait. Okay? Now here's where this gets really interesting. If you look in the fish evolutionary tree, what you find is this undulating tripod gait evolved at least 5, probably much more times in the fish record. That is, you have lungfish that do it, you have Polypterus that does it, catfish, snakeheads, sculpins. This is just what we know, that we were able to get. But they have a version of this. And their bodies look very different. Their fins look very different. Some of them pull around their fin in the body. Remember I told you bend the body and pull around the fin? Some of them don't use the fin. Some of them use their head. But they stick their head to the ground and bend the back. Okay, so head, fin's different shape. It's a real fad in fish evolution. So they do this over and over and over again. And when we look at these different species, whether it's a lungfish, a snakehead, a catfish, the overall gait is very similar. So it seems to be a default sort of system in certain kinds of fish to walk in this way. And so to understand this, and this is where I'll close, is robotics becomes very important in this. I know that sounds strange, but it becomes extremely important. Because with a robot, we could break this system down into its simple component parts, and we can vary them. We can do 1 million years of evolution in a single day by just changing parameters in a robot. And we can ask, how robust is this system to different changes? And this is where Michael Ishida and Fumi Aida of the Human Frontiers Grant came important. So we can begin with the organisms, but we can look at a robot, an actual physical robot, or we can do a simulated robot. Either way, Michael built a very simple physical robot, this is it, with 3 segments, and it squirms and pulls exactly like a polypterus, and it could be built at different scales, and it's very robust to frictional surface, whether they walk on sandpaper or a smooth surface. It's very robust to the shape of the body. It's very robust to the shape of the fin. It's a default robust condition. It's highly robust to robotic perturbation, which is good because that's what we see. It's a point of evolution for many different fish. But really, all you need for this is you need axial flexibility. You need to be able to bend your back, right? That's good. You need the ability to have ground contact. That's good too. And so a body shape that allows that. And a favorable mass distribution. But after that, you really don't need any special adaptations. And it automatically does it. And it'll do it in low friction, high friction, you name it. So to close, what are we learning here by all this? So from the undulating tripod gait, so default walking in fish seems to be this undulating walking gait. And what's remarkable here, and this is coming from somebody who studies fins for a living, no special fin adaptations are needed, exclamation point, exclamation point. Really, all you need is axial bending, substrate contact, and the right geometry of the body. And this may be a precursor, I think, and this is a hypothesis, a speculation, to more derived behaviors. Because in this kind of way, if this is a default, think about what I told you about Tiktaalik. Think about it, you had a shoulder and a hip that lock in place. Well, it could be a precursor to more derived behaviors, that this passive stability I talked about in Tiktaalik all of a sudden becomes an important next step. Because if you can lock the fins in place, and you're using axial bending to move in an undulating tripod gait, all of a sudden you're moving better. Any way you do that, you're moving better, and you're doing it for free. That is, the bone is providing the support, not the muscles. Okay, so what have we learned? We've talked about robots, we've talked about plants, we've talked about a lot of things. Walking arose many times in fish without digits. We know that. In fact, you knew that probably before this lecture. Swimming slowly is costly, and again, perhaps more than walking. We don't know that for sure, but that seems to be a reasonable hypothesis. Talk to me in a year or two, and we'll have a test. The most common fish gait is one that does not require special fin adaptations, which is remarkable. And importantly, and this is kind of what I want to think about, is that continuum exists between standing and walking in water and terrestrial locomotion. That creatures adapting to walk on the water, or creatures walk in the water, sorry, these are not biblical. They're able to walk in the water, on the water bottom. Creatures that are able to station hold and grip the bottom. Creatures that are able to live in the shallows or mud flats. All that is precursors, because those same functions are useful in terrestrial adaptation. They can be modified in novel ways. And so now what we're doing is using robotics to build a robotic polypterus. We can manipulate fin shape, fin orientation, gait, body size. We can take an experimental robotic approach to this. You can measure energy consumption in robots. Robots can tell us a lot of things that, in conjunction with the fossil record and in conjunction with studying living fish, that will provide new insights. Thank you very much.